Ask a sailor in the age of sail what he feared most, and he wouldn't say the storm. He wouldn't say the enemy, or disease, or even drowning. He would say fire. And that sounds absurd at first. You are floating on an infinite supply of water, surrounded by the one thing that puts fire out. How could fire possibly be the worst thing that could happen to you? That's exactly the trap. Because a wooden sailing ship was, in every practical sense, a floating bonfire waiting for a spark, and the endless water all around it could not save you. Fire at sea was so feared that experienced captains would genuinely rather face a hurricane than a flame loose below decks. A storm might take your ship. A fire took your ship and left you nowhere to stand while it did. So let's really get into this. Why fire was the true king of a sailor's nightmares, and what a crew actually did in the desperate minutes after the two words no one ever wanted to hear: fire aboard. Start with what the ship was actually made of, because this is where the horror begins. A sailing ship was, structurally, a giant dried-out woodpile that happened to be shaped like a boat. The timber had been seasoned for years to make it strong, which is another way of saying it had been dried out until almost every drop of moisture was gone. Above the waterline, the entire vessel was bone-dry wood, and it wasn't just the frame. To keep a wooden ship from leaking, every seam between every plank was packed with oakum, loose, tarred rope fiber, and then sealed over with tar and pitch. Chemically, those are not waterproofing materials so much as fuel that happens to also keep water out. The standing rigging, the miles of rope that held the masts up, was coated in tar to protect it from the salt. The sails were canvas, and canvas was often treated with oils and tallow to help it hold its shape. Every surface a spark could land on had been deliberately soaked in something that burns. A ship didn't merely have the potential to catch fire. A ship, in a very real sense, wanted to burn. It was built out of the appetite for it. And then, on top of a structure that was already the most flammable object for 1,000 miles in any direction, you loaded it with the most dangerous cargo human beings had yet invented. Deep in the ship sat the magazine, the powder room, holding barrels of gunpowder, sometimes tons of it, the entire reason a warship could fight at all. Elsewhere in the hold were casks of rum and brandy, high-proof spirits that are, for firefighting purposes, simply liquid fire in a wooden container. There was oil for every lamp on the ship. There was pitch and turpentine kept ready for repairs, both of which will catch from the smallest spark. The cruel arithmetic of a fighting ship was that the very things it needed in order to sail, to fight, and to survive were precisely the things that could convert a single small flame into a floating explosion. On a warship, a fire that reached the powder magazine did not damage the vessel. It did not sink it. It erased it, instantly, in a single blast that could kill every soul aboard, faster than any of them could understand what was happening. Ships were known to vanish in an eye blink, leaving nothing but floating splinters and a ringing silence where a crew of hundreds had been a moment before. So if the ship was this delicately balanced bomb, where did the fire actually come from? And here is the most tragic part of the whole story. The fire almost never came from the enemy. It came from the very things that were keeping the crew alive. Consider the galley stove. Every scrap of hot food on a months-long voyage was cooked over an open fire, burning in an iron box, in the middle of a wooden building, every single day, for months on end. Consider the lanterns. The only way to see anything below decks, in those windowless wooden caverns, was open flame. Dozens of small fires swinging on hooks in cramped, tar-soaked passages, inches from rope and timber. Add to that a candle knocked from a table by a sudden roll of the ship. A single spark spat from the cook's fire, landing somewhere it shouldn't. A pipe smoked in a forbidden corner by a man who thought, just this once, it would be fine. The fire that destroyed a ship almost never arrived with drama. It arrived on an ordinary, forgettable afternoon, from a source so mundane nobody had been watching it. Now here is the thing about fire at sea that makes it categorically more terrifying than fire anywhere else on Earth. And it is the one thing people never stop to think about.
Run!
You cannot escape it. Think about what you instinctively do when a building catches fire on land. You run out of the building. You get away from the fire and onto safe ground, and the fire, however much it destroys, is behind you. At sea, there is no out. There is no away. There is no safe ground. The burning building is the only object standing between you and 2.5 miles of freezing black water. You are, quite literally, trapped on top of the fuel. Your options collapse down to 2, and both of them are trying to kill you. Stay and fight the fire that is consuming your only refuge, or leap off into an ocean so cold it will stop your heart in minutes, 1,000 miles from the nearest land. Every other disaster at sea, the storm, the leak, even the enemy, left a sailor with the one thing fire took away. Somewhere, however grim, to run to. Fire cornered you on your own home and set the home alight. And then comes the detail that surprises absolutely everyone. The cruelest irony in the entire age of sail. The ocean, the literally infinite supply of water in every direction, was almost completely useless for putting the fire out. This feels impossible when you first hear it. How can a ship sitting on top of an entire ocean ever struggle to find water? But stop and think about the actual physical problem the crew faced. All that water is below you. It is over the side, down past the rail, at the bottom of a drop. To use it against a fire, you first have to lift it, pull it up out of the sea by hand, one heavy bucket at a time, haul it up and over the rail, and then carry it down, into the very belly of the ship, into the choking smoke and heat where the fire is actually burning. A chain of exhausted men passing buckets could move, at best, a thin and pitiful trickle of water. Meanwhile, tarred and seasoned wood, once properly alight, burns with astonishing speed and ferocity. The race was never fair. The fire climbed faster than the water ever could. The single greatest ocean on the planet sat inches away on all sides, and almost none of it could be brought to the fight in time. To be surrounded by water and unable to use a drop of it, that was the specific, maddening nightmare that fire at sea represented. So, with the entire universe seemingly stacked against them, what did sailors actually do when the terrible cry went up and smoke started rising through the deck planks? Because, and this is important, they were absolutely not helpless. Over centuries of watching ships burn to the waterline, the men of the Age of Sail assembled a genuine, sophisticated system for surviving the unsurvivable. And the striking thing about that system is that the overwhelming majority of it was not about fighting fire at all. It was about prevention. Because sailors had learned, through the deaths of countless crews before them, one hard and simple truth. Once a real fire had properly taken hold on a wooden ship, it was very often already over. The only fire you could reliably beat was the one that never got the chance to start. So, first and most important of all, they controlled open flame with an obsessiveness that can be hard to imagine today. The rules governing fire and light aboard a ship were strict to the point of ruthlessness, and they were enforced without mercy, because everyone understood that a single careless man could kill every other man on the ship. On most vessels, every fire and every light had to be extinguished by a fixed hour of the evening, the literal origin of the phrase, lights out. After that hour, the entire ship went dark, and no exceptions were tolerated. The galley fire, the one that fed everyone, was doused completely the moment the weather turned rough, which is the real reason a storm always meant cold food and cold men. The ship would rather everyone go hungry than risk an open flame while the vessel pitched and rolled. Near the powder magazine, the most dangerous room on the ship, no naked flame was ever permitted under any circumstances. Instead, the men working in that darkness relied on a clever solution. A lantern was sealed away in a separate little room behind a thick pane of glass, so that its light could shine through into the magazine while its actual flame never touched the powder-laden air. Smoking, that small daily comfort, was restricted to one single controlled location on the entire ship, if it was permitted at all. None of this was comfortable. All of it was necessary. Discipline, boring and relentless and strictly enforced, was the first and by far the most effective firefighting tool the Age of Sail ever had, because the surest way to win a fight against a fire is to make sure it never begins. But prevention could only ever reduce the odds, not eliminate them. So the second layer of the system was preparation. On a well-run ship, every single man was assigned a specific station and a specific job for a fire, exactly the way he was assigned a station for battle. When the alarm sounded, there was to be no confusion, no milling about, no precious seconds lost deciding who should do what. Some men went straight to the pumps. Others fell into the bucket chains, forming a human conveyor belt from the sea to the flames. And a certain unlucky few had the single most frightening job on the ship, to advance directly toward the fire itself, carrying soaked blankets, wet swabs, and anything else that could be thrown over flames to smother them. Every man knew his exact place in this machine, because a fire gave you no time whatsoever to organize one. In the first 60 seconds, the ship was either fighting the fire as a single coordinated body, or it was already losing. Seconds were the entire currency of survival. The third layer was the hardware, and here, sailors turned the tools of one disaster against another. The same bilge pumps that a crew used to fight flooding during a storm could be repurposed in a fire, rigged with a length of hose to throw an actual stream of seawater directly onto the flames. This was one of the only ways in existence to move water in real, meaningful volume, rather than in feeble bucketfuls. And over time, ships began to carry dedicated fire engines and purpose-built pumps for exactly this task. It was still, more often than not, a desperate and losing race against fire that simply burned faster than any pump of the era could deliver water. But a stream from a pump was worth 100 buckets, and sometimes, just sometimes, 100 buckets worth of water arriving in time was the difference between a scorched deck and a lost ship. And then there was the fourth and most drastic measure of all, the one that reveals just how upside down the logic of fire at sea truly was. Sailors were sometimes willing to deliberately flood their own ship in order to save it. If a fire crept close to the powder magazine, the one compartment whose ignition meant the instant, total annihilation of the entire vessel, the crew could take a decision that sounds insane until you understand the stakes. They would deliberately open the valves and let the sea pour into the magazine, drowning the gunpowder in cold seawater before the fire could ever reach it. Sit with what that means for a moment. To stop a fire from blowing the ship apart, they would invite the ocean, the exact thing that sinks ships, the enemy they fought every single day at the pumps, into the heart of the ship, on purpose, by their own hands. They chose to drown the powder to prevent the blast. They chose a controlled, deliberate flooding over an uncontrolled, instantaneous explosion. And that choice, that willingness to commit a smaller catastrophe in cold blood to head off a larger one, was the entire brutal logic of fire at sea distilled into a single act. Every option in front of you is terrible. Survival simply means recognizing which terrible option is the least terrible one, and choosing it faster than the fire can choose for you. Now here is where the whole picture turns over on itself, because for all its horror, fire was not only the sailors' greatest enemy, it was also, when they chose to make it so, one of their most feared weapons, and one of their most essential tools. And nowhere is that clearer than in a thing called the fire ship. For centuries, one of the most dreaded weapons in all of naval warfare was not a bigger cannon or a faster ship. It was an old, expendable vessel, deliberately stuffed to the rails with tar, pitch, oil, and gunpowder, turned, on purpose, into the very floating bomb that every sailor feared above all else. The crew would set it alight, aim it at a tightly packed enemy fleet, lock its steering, and then abandon it into small boats and row for their lives, leaving the blazing ship to drift into the enemy on wind and current. And here is why it worked so devastatingly well. It worked precisely because every captain in the world shared the same deepest instinct, to flee from fire at any cost. A single burning ship drifting silently into a crowded anchorage at night could throw an entire fleet into absolute chaos. Ships cutting their anchor cables, colliding with one another in the dark, running aground, all to avoid the flames. And in that panic, a single worthless old hulk could destroy or scatter a fortune in far more valuable warships without a shot being fired. Sailors understood the terror of fire so completely, so intimately, that they learned to pick it up and aim it at their enemies. And fire, kept under control, was not just a weapon, it was survival itself, the thing without which no long voyage was even possible. That same dangerous galley stove, the one that could burn the whole ship down, was also the only source of hot food on a voyage that might last the better part of a year. And hot food was not a luxury, but a genuine pillar of keeping a crew alive and able to work. That same fire boiled the water, heated the tar for essential repairs to the hull, and softened the materials the carpenter needed to keep the ship watertight. The flame in a lantern was the single thin line between a sailor and the total disorienting darkness of the lower decks, where a man could not otherwise find his own hands. The very element that could, in one careless second, erase an entire ship and everyone aboard it, was also the element that cooked their every meal, lit their every night, warmed them through freezing watches, and sealed the very hull that kept the sea out. Fire at sea was never a simple enemy. It was a servant of extraordinary usefulness that carried, at all times, the power to become the deadliest killer on the ship in a single unguarded moment. And every sailor, every day of his life at sea, lived knowingly and unavoidably inside that exact bargain. So, after all of it, what did sailors actually do when the ship caught fire? The honest answer is that, more than anything else, they spent their entire lives making sure it never happened in the first place. They put the lights out at the appointed hour, every night, without fail. They doused the galley fire the instant the sea turned rough, and ate their cold food without complaint. They walled the gunpowder away from every possible flame, and lit it only through sealed glass. They drilled their fire stations with the same deadly seriousness as their battle stations, so that when seconds mattered, no second was wasted. And when, despite everything, fire did break out, as, across enough voyages, it eventually always did, they formed their bucket chains and worked their pumps against an enemy that climbed faster than water could ever be lifted. And in the very worst case, they made the almost unthinkable choice to flood their own magazine, to let the killing sea into the ship with their own hands, rather than let the ship blow itself to splinters. They survived fire the same way they survived every other horror the ocean could produce. Not through some burst of courage in the terrible moment, but through 100 small, dull, relentlessly enforced disciplines drilled into them long beforehand. Because on a wooden ship, alone in the middle of the ocean, the terrible moment was almost always far too late to save you. The battle against fire, like the battle against the sea itself, was only ever truly won long before it began. Fire, storm, disease, the enemy, the slow starvation of a becalmed sea. A sailor in the age of sail faced every one of these dangers on the boards of a single wooden deck, and faced them knowing that any one of them could be the last thing he ever knew. But there was one voyage, one single famous night, when many of these dangers seemed to gather and come for one ship all at once. And the people who faced them that night were not hardened sailors at all. They were ordinary passengers, dressed for dinner, who had been promised, and had every reason to believe, that the ship beneath their feet was the safest thing ever built by human hands. They thought they were safe. They were told the ship could not sink. What actually happened in the final hours aboard the most famous shipwreck in all of history? That is the next video.